Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, team, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and this is our 5th event. This edition of Lead Dev Bookmarked is sponsored by Work & Co. Thank you to them for helping us put this together. Make sure to join the Lead Dev Slack workspace. We'll take some questions live and continue the discussion there afterwards. You can find details at leaddev.com/bookmarked. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup, and I'm a leadership coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond. Today we'll be talking about team topologies with Manuel Pais. Manuel is an organizational IT consultant and trainer focused on team interactions, delivery practices, and accelerating flow. Recognized by Tech Beacon in 2019 as one of the top 100 people to follow in DevOps. He is also the co-author of the book, Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow. He helps organizations rethink their approach to software delivery, operations, and support via strategic assessments, practical workshops, and coaching. Welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote this book with Matthew Skelton. Why did the two of you decide to write this book? What was like the pain you were trying to solve?
So that's a good question. It's interesting because me and Matthew, we were working together more or less since 2015, and we're doing consulting for different clients around DevOps and continuous delivery, especially. And we would often get asked to, help them implement a new tool chain or some new, pipelines for their continuous delivery approach, or help them with their kind of operability aspects. And what we would often find that yes, those things could use some help, but there were often problems in the way that teams in those organizations, in those clients, were interacting or not interacting, or the way lack of clarity on what exactly is their purpose within the kind of ecosystem of teams. And so this was kind of an ongoing conversation that me and Matthew had for several years, like, why are these teams organized in this way and seems to work well and, in their context, or, versus problems that we would see in other organizations. So it actually started with a website called DevOps Topologies that Matthew started, and then I helped him maintain and evolve it, which was a bit more focused, obviously, on DevOps topologies, on types of DevOps teams that we'd see, and how that, kind of a little bit patterns, antipatterns that we saw there. And then team topologies kind of grew from there as we kind of refined and from our experience with the clients, we could see what were the kind of principles and patterns that were working for some and which ones were not working. And so that evolved into team topologies, which kind of a broader overview, still focused on technology teams, but kind of a broader view than DevOps, just in general, what are the fundamental topologies that we saw working and interactions and et cetera.
When it just reminds me, when you say, topology, what do you mean by topology? What's just for folks who are maybe not familiar with that word? Yeah,
it's actually comes from ancient Greek. It means the way that different parts interact and relate to each other. So when we say team topology, so we're obviously talking about how different teams in an organization, how are they related to each other and how they interact. So that's fundamentally what we saw, that there was a lot of misunderstanding or lack of clarity in many organizations, because it's not enough just to say, well, we have all these teams and now we're going to do the work, but there are dependencies between teams. And if we don't understand that, and if they don't have a clear picture of what they are supposed to to achieve and how they're supposed to relate to each other, then you start having a lot of problems, which often are more significant than even any kind of tooling or practices problems that you might have as well.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I know we're going to talk more about that today for sure. I'm so excited that you brought that up. So the book builds on Conway's Law. Can you define it for those who aren't aware of that, and then maybe how you use it?
Sure. So this came from a paper written by Mel Conway back in 1968, if I'm not mistaken. So quite a long time ago, but only when we started seeing more traction around microservices and things like that, people start talking more about Conway's Law, but it has always been around. And so what it says, kind of in a nutshell, is that there's a correlation between the organization structures and team structures and the architecture of your products and of the systems that you produce. And so the way that teams relate to each other and communicate is kind of going to prevail, if you like, in the results, in the resulting system and products that you create. So there's this kind of mirroring effect. But as pointed out by Ruth Mallon, kind of the organizational structures kind of win in the end, or they prevail. So the implication of this is that actually we need to think about those two together. We should not have kind of either just our senior managers or HR making decisions about organizational design and teams without an understanding of the technical aspects of the architecture that's going to result from there. Because when those two things are defined independently, you have technical people talking about system architecture, and you have perhaps HR or management deciding on organizational structures, then Conway's Law says those two are related. So we need to co-evolve them if we want to get better results. If we don't, if we ignore Conway's Law, we're not aware of it, what happens, it's probably going to cost us a lot more. It's not that it's impossible, but it's going to cost a lot of more effort to achieve some sort of architecture that we want for our systems if the way the teams are set up is very different from that architecture.
Yeah, and that brings me into think about like what is you talk about org chart thinking, and so I'm curious, like, what is org chart thinking and why is it an issue as that relates to all of this?
Yeah, I should say it's not always necessarily intentional. So so even might not be org chart thinking, but just the way that people behave when people look at the org chart as this represents the communication pathways between teams and different parts of the organization. In some cases, it's intentional. So from management or leads who interpret the org chart as, this is how we're supposed to communicate. If we're in this department, we're not communicating with people in that other department. So that's counterproductive. So again, thinking about Conway's Law, that means we are restricting the communication lines between different teams that might need to interact to achieve the results that we want in terms of our what we're offering to our customers and the products we're creating. So we don't want to limit those communications up front. I mean, org charts are useful, so we're not saying that they don't have a purpose. They're useful for reporting, they're useful for alignment of goals and top down between CEO all the way down to what the teams are working on. So that's useful, but org chart thinking in terms of looking at it as representing communication between teams is what's can be counterproductive.
Yeah, and it strikes me too, you talk quite a bit about communication, and when you think about like the way that the structures are happening and the way communication flows, it can also add team cognitive load, which I know you talk about. And I'm curious what you all mean by that, and maybe some ways to reduce that load on teams.
Yeah, so very quickly, cognitive load has been defined in the 80s at an individual level as the total amount of mental effort being used in our working memory, which is limited. So we've applied that idea to teams. So because teams are limited in size, that means their capacity as a group, their cognitive capacity also has a limit, right? And so because we're in the book Team Topologies, we're talking about achieving fast flow. So that's kind of the starting point, that we know that organizations need to be able to deliver faster, but also, being better at how they support their products and evolve their products. And so we want teams to have the capacity to have ownership over perhaps not a whole product, but part of a product that is meaningful for our customers. And so we talk about, we hear a lot about cross-functional teams, autonomous teams, but these teams have a limit on their cognitive capacity, right? So if we're asking them to do too much, then the results start to be impacted because, for this limited size of the team, they cannot possibly take on all the skills that we would expect from a fully cross-functional team delivering a product, from requirements and user needs all the way to building and running this part of the product. So when we have cognitive load, when we understand that there's a limit, then we need to, if we can. If we understand different types of cognitive load, then we can start doing something about it. Because there's cognitive load that's coming from perhaps the team members lack some skills that they need to do their work. And so that's usually called intrinsic cognitive load, which we can address through training, through perhaps pair programming, coaching, etc. There's another type of cognitive load which is called extraneous, and that's related to all the kind of tasks that we need to do to deliver the work and to deliver value to our customers, but it's not directly related to the business. So for example, if we need to understand how do I deploy my application, or how do I run the tests, or how do I access the database, or whatever it might be, these are all kind of compounding our cognitive load. So what can we do about that? So obviously automation can help, but there's a lot more that we should be thinking about in terms of the team topologies and team responsibilities. And so the point of reducing those types of cognitive load is to leave more space for the third one, which is the germane cognitive load, which is everything related to the business domain, to the kind of the problem space that we're trying to bring solutions to, and obviously to address customers' needs. So we want to free up more space in the team's capacity to address the actual business problems, and not, spending all their effort on this kind of superfluous tasks, or, on skills that are lacking.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned something a couple times about team size, and I know you all have some thoughts on team size. Could you just quickly tell us a couple of your high-level thoughts on team size as it relates to, as cognitive load and all of it, actually, just, flow?
Yeah, so team size is directly related to kind of the trust that we're able to instill in this team. So it has been researched by people like Robin Dunbar, who's an anthropologist, and other people, and we've come to find that 7 ± 2 is generally the recommended size, so that you have a very cohesive team. Obviously it takes time, not from one day to another, but There's also the aspect of, for people familiar with the Tuckman model, where he says there are different phases of building a high-performing team. So there's an aspect of keeping a team together for a reasonable amount of time, but also a limitation on how many people. So up to 9 is usually what we found to provide a higher level of trust. It might go a bit beyond that, but it starts to be difficult, because then you start having, within this bigger team, you start having kind of sub-teams, and you start having some specialization within the team. That means we start having dependencies inside the team, which might slow down the flow of work. So usually up to 9 is the recommended size.
Great. I know you talked about that a lot in the book, so I wanted to make sure to get that in there, because I do think that team size has been sort of debated over the years about what size is the right, what is the right size for all of that. So thank you. Super helpful. So I want to go a little bit more into, some of the real meat of the book. Apologies to people who are vegans and vegetarians to that allusion, but I want to talk about can you describe for us like the 4 fundamental team topologies that you all talk about?
Yeah, definitely. So the kind of cross-functional teams I was talking about, we call them stream-aligned teams. So usually they're aligned to what you would call a value stream in the organization. And so, as I was saying before, if you want them to be this type of team to be able to deliver and build and run their product or part of a product in an efficient way, in a fast way, then they're going to need a lot of different skills, and they're going to need, that's going to put a burden on their cognitive load that we were talking about. And that's where the other 3 topologies come in. So they're kind of supporting topologies, if you like. And their goal for existing is to reduce cognitive load on stream-aligned teams. So those teams that deliver the kind of direct customer value. And so the supporting topologies that we talk about are platform, enabling, and complicated subsystem. So a platform topology is kind of a team that's providing some usually lower level services that the streamlined teams need. Usually starts with things like continuous delivery, CI/CD, monitoring, logging, those kind of services that we expect, and capabilities that we, in general, all the streamlined teams that are creating some sort of digital product are going to need to build and run that product. So we have the platform team to provide these services. And over time, this tends to grow into more kind of perhaps data APIs or other kind of start to be more business specific services. But there is, if we can have a good boundary between what is the responsibility of the platform and what is the responsibility of streamlined teams, that can be quite powerful. And then enabling teams in general are addressing gaps in skills, gaps in practices in the streamlined teams. As I was saying before, to have this kind of end-to-end ownership in the streamlined teams, they're going to need to understand product management, obviously all the technology aspects of the product, also kind of user experience aspects, operability, etc. So architecture. So there's a lot that they're going to need to have at least a reasonable understanding. And usually it's very hard to find a team where you have all these skills already. So enabling team is going to help them. It's usually a team of experts that are going to essentially teach and help the streamlined teams gain the skills that they're lacking. So it might be an enabling team around monitoring or around product management, whatever. There is a gap in the stream teams that we want to address. And finally, complicated subsystem teams. It's a kind of particular case where you might have a very complicated part of a product, which is not kind of end user facing, but it's something that requires a lot of expertise. Perhaps in some cases, you might need people with PhDs to understand some sort of complicated algorithm, or things like face recognition algorithms, or real-time trading, and very particular cases. But we recognize that sometimes you need this team to own that part of the system or the product, because it would be too much to ask from a cognitive law perspective on a product team to also understand this kind of complex, complicated algorithm. So there's kind of a particular case that we realize it's needed. But again, all of these supporting topologies start from, do we need to address cognitive load on the streamline teams? If it's too much, what can we do to help to reduce that? And that's where the supporting topologies come in.
And I'm curious, will companies, I mean, obviously it varies upon the size of the company, where they are in the product life cycle. Are there companies that have all four, just two? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, how do people, are there lots of different configurations, is my guess in this, and how might people know what might be a good configuration?
So we're not talking about a specific model of how we set up the teams. We're talking about the topologies and the interactions between teams to have some patterns that help us evolve over time. So at one moment we might have 10 streamline teams, and we might realize that actually what we need to do is have more enabling teams, and who can become part of an enabling team. Because sometimes you have, again, if we just let each team to their own devices without looking at the bigger picture, then sometimes you might have a team that's really good in their CI/CD, for example, but they're not very good in the operability of their systems, and vice versa. So once we identify, what are the gaps in the teams and what are the purpose of the teams, then we can start adapting and address whatever the gaps. Maybe we need more help from a platform to help us do some sort of aspects of the life cycle of the products that we would, it's too much burden on the teams. Perhaps we might have some stream teams that are taking on too much responsibility in terms of infrastructure, for example, and that might be moved to the platform. And so we're expecting this to evolve over time. But like you said, what we see today in many organizations, they will have similar to streamline teams, often with, with some gaps, and platform teams. But the thinking and the clarity of purpose is not always clear. So, and in particular for platforms, we see a lot of kind of big platforms where you have many people working on these internal platforms without actually talking to their internal customers, and building a lot of technical stuff, but we're not actually addressing the needs of those streamline teams. So again, the idea is to have these patterns and these topologies in order to allow us to adapt and understand what we are lacking today and how can we address that.
Yeah, one thing I really took from the book is that there isn't maybe one right answer for every single situation, and that also that they'll evolve over time. You have not like set and forget. You know what I mean? Like that you have to continue to evolve, and that this is part of what I saw the strength of the team topologies approach was that ability to be flexible and change given to team demands, market demands, product demands, et cetera, as you go along.
Yeah, what you need the teams to have a clarity of purpose, right? And then understand what are the gaps and what is changing. And as you said, both kind of externally in terms of the business needs and the market demands, and internally often kind of the technology, the technology side, but also kind of the organizational side where we might identify, actually, we're trying to have teams to be more autonomous, but we have this dependency between these different teams that there is always slowing us down. So if we are sensing for those types of problems and we're identifying, we need to address this dependency that is slowing us down, and that then we can look at how to do that using the topologies and interactions, or perhaps we have to go back to understanding our business value streams and rearrange slightly the teams based on that. So yeah, it's always kind of trying to identify what we need to address based on our current situation, which is very different from what you see in many organizations that, for example, and we saw that when we were consulting for DevOps, where they do a big reorg, where they say, well, we're going to change the roles, we're going to create DevOps teams or what have you, and they're not actually understanding first what is the current gap today to achieve what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's so great, that whole idea of purpose. And you've mentioned in here team interaction patterns, and I know that there are I think there are 3 key team interaction patterns. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. So we have the topologies, but even that is not enough, right? So if teams don't know how they're supposed to interact with others, which is often the case because there hasn't been much literature or kind of understanding of different types of interactions. And so one of those 3 that we talk about is collaboration, which seems kind of obvious, right? Everyone talks about collaboration, where you have 2 teams or more working together to hopefully with a clear goal. What are we trying to achieve with this collaboration? So there's definitely that type of interaction. But what we're saying in the book is that we should have a kind of a timeline for that collaboration. So it shouldn't be something that is kind of open-ended, but if we have a specific goal, we should have a specific goal for this objective. What is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is the solution we're trying to discover, and how long do we expect this to take? Because otherwise the collaboration might become a dependency, right? We're always, we're collaborating, but if that goes on and is recurring over time, then it's actually a dependency. And the other interaction modes are X as a service, which essentially, obviously the name is based on things like infrastructure as a service or software as a service, where you have essentially, you are providing a service, especially the platform teams are usually providing service to the internal teams. If the service is well defined, it meets the needs of their internal customers, then you don't expect to actually need to interact, right? You're just the customer of the platform is just going to use the service, and if it has good documentation, good usability, etc., then they shouldn't need help. So that's the second one. And the third one is the facilitation, which is the typical interaction mode with enabling teams, where they're facilitating knowledge to these stream-aligned teams. And so you have 2 teams. Again, they should have a clear goal and a clear kind of timeline for this interaction. How long is this facilitation going to take? And so this might be an enabling team helping a stream-aligned team to create some deployment pipelines or automate some tests. But in the sense of providing them the understanding of what are the necessary practices, the available tooling, etc., to help them gain skills much faster than they would if they're just left to their own devices. And so these 3 interaction modes might be happening between any 2 teams might use this 3 interaction modes, but it just gives a lot of clarity. It's something that you can, and teams should kind of make clear in their roadmap or in their kind of, wherever they're documenting what they're doing, to say, well, we're collaborating with the platform team to improve the service X, or we are being helped by enabling team to gain some knowledge in some domain. and this provides clarity over what's happening at a certain moment in time. What are we trying to achieve, and what are the gaps today?
Yeah, what it strikes me about everything that you all talk about and the approach is just really having conversations about the really important things and clarity and organizing so that to reduce cognitive load and keep everybody sort of focused on the most important thing.
Yeah, I think, what we've seen is often organizations are starting from either very technical point of view and focusing on very technical aspects, or there's a disconnect between the organizational side and the team structures and the technical side, and so those things evolve together. So we can't really address kind of key problems in terms of flow, in terms of organization, and in terms of achieving the goals of the business without bringing this two you often separate worlds together. Have people talk about these things like Conway's Law, cognitive load, and that was actually one of the really nice feedback we've got from the book is that it brought together these ideas and provided a lexicon for people to discuss the problems. When we talk about cognitive load, is something that kind of triggers kind of a quick, people identify very quickly with this idea. They understand, yes, that's a problem that we've seen in teams, and when you start to be able to talk about problems, then more likely to find some solutions or some steps towards reducing those problems.
Yeah, it's so good. All right, I have one last question. I don't want to keep you too long. So change is hard, especially anything of the organizational type. And I think some teams might find themselves pretty far from an approach that looks like the team topologies approach. How do you suggest teams begin shifting the way they think of, the conversations they're having and the way that they organize?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's very true what you just said. So one of the interesting things about team topology is that actually you can start applying some of these ideas and some of these patterns, today or tomorrow, regardless of where you sit in the organization. So obviously not everything, but for example, if you're just, if you're an individual contributor in a team, or if you're part of a team, you can start creating a team API, for example, that we talk about in the book, which clarifies to other teams, how do we like to interact? What are the communication channels, preferred communication patterns, etc. So this already starts to reduce cognitive load on other teams, at least in how they communicate with you, start to reduce misunderstandings on, how do we ask this team to make a change, or there's a lot that can be done, but obviously there's some aspects where you need kind of senior management to be involved. But you could start today even just identifying gaps in your teams, kind of looking at the topologies, for example, and understanding, are we more or less of a streamlined team, and what would be the things that need to change to be more aligned with that topology, and clarifying then what are interaction modes with others. So I think there's a lot that can be done by teams, even if there's not a kind of global in the organization kind of understanding of team topologies yet. And then we've seen also examples where when you have kind of the senior management already understanding the ideas of team topologies, and where they've actually been able to map their teams to the topologies and start adopting the patterns in the book, kind of in a broader way inside the organization, and that has been quite successful. It also kind of helps teams understand when they need to to do, for example, discovery, when they need to collaborate, and when should they be focusing on providing a more reliable service so that they move to X as a service and so on. So again, I think it can be done from a team point of view. And then as you get more kind of traction around the ideas of team topologies, it can expand to the rest of the organization.
I love that. Yeah, start with some of the talking, even in start with some small things in small ways. Do you have a minute? I have a question here. Do you have a minute to answer a question from the audience? So the question is, could you please describe some anti-patterns, team arrangements you might think would be successful, but aren't?
So it's all has to do with not just the teams that we have, but also kind of the responsibilities and the ways they interact, right? So when we're talking about DevOps, for example, there's always this question, should we have DevOps teams or not? But we've seen in different organizations, you had a team that's called DevOps team, and they were doing very different things. So again, taking a step back and think about, okay, what are the responsibilities of this team? Are they helping other teams reduce their cognitive load? Then perhaps it's a good pattern. Or are they kind of the owners of, tooling, and they're, the way they interact with other teams is kind of on request basis, that other teams need something, they need to send a request to the DevOps team to do it and then come back to them. That's going to slow us down, right? It's going to affect the flow of that team that has that request. In that case, would probably be an anti-pattern. And that brings up the point that, we often rely too much just on team names, and that's not enough to convey actually what is the responsibility, what are the kind of the boundaries and interactions between different teams. We're just create teams and give teams names, and that's not enough.
Yeah, it really requires conversation to understand the purpose, the boundaries, the load, all of that. I've got one more, if you don't mind. We'll do it real quick, if that's okay. No, like one more, just one more. I promise. This is the last one, everybody. Manuel is topic. It's so fascinating. All right, last one. At the end of the book, you say that there are other resources that are good for learning about how to make organizational changes. Could you please touch on some methods you've seen that are successful?
I don't remember exactly that part of the book. In general.
Yeah, general answer is great. Anything to help us, guide us.
Yeah. Yeah, like you're saying in the question, organizational change is hard. So starting small is always important. So one thing that we've seen can work well when we're trying to align with team topologies is that you can take a small cluster of teams that are kind of closely related. Perhaps they're working on the same value stream. And you can start with a few teams, 4 or 5 teams, and you start to do what we were talking about before, what is the gap between these teams and the kind of fundamental topologies? What would need to change so that we have more kind of streamlined teams, and what are problems in terms of cognitive load for those teams? What do we need to do to address that? Or if we have already a platform team, what is the gap between the way that they work and provide value to internal teams versus what we talk about in the book, and what a modern platform team should be doing, especially thinking of the platform as a product with internal users. So you need to care about, you need to understand their needs, you need to care about the usability of the platform, etc. So you could start with a kind of small cluster of teams and start discussing the problems, try some of these ideas, and then expand it to other teams as you go. So definitely not a kind of big bang change where now all the teams are different, and that's not what we're talking about. And usually it's not very effective because it has kind of side effects where you often have people who have been through, 2, 3 or more reorganizations, and they're like, here comes another reorganization, and they don't really trust that it's going to bring a lot of benefit anymore. And
Right.
so it's much better to do it in small kind of experiments almost, where you're trying some of these ideas and see how that helps.
Yeah, I love that. I think if I had sum it up, like what I get from the book is incremental experiments and ongoing. Again, don't set and forget, and keep having the conversation about what the team needs to accomplish and where those boundaries are.
Yeah, it's almost like becoming more of an organism that evolves continuously, rather than waiting for a big reorganization to change things.
Yeah, I will say that I think that we forget that organisms are dynamic and they're constantly changing. And I think that what this book, my background is organizational strategy. And as I read this book, I thought, oh, wow, this is a really great antidote to some of those really big reorgs that especially came out of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I think we've evolved, but it's such a really good new way of sort of thinking about continual change and thinking about the organism as dynamic rather than something that's just set in stone. And that gives us a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, and that also will kind of bring us to also the point that when we talk about more autonomous teams and with Agile and DevOps and so on, we also start talking about also, what is the role of kind of management then. If teams can be more autonomous, then they can focus, shift their focus from projects and managing teams to actually look at the boundaries between teams and look at what are the problems that we're seeing in the topologies overall, in the relationships between teams, and try to help with that kind of cross-boundary role, if you like, for management. But we could spend another 30 minutes to an hour talking about it.
It struck me. I thought, there's definitely implications for management. Thank you so much, Manuel. This has been such a thoughtful and interesting conversation. I know everyone's been excited. And I know we had a couple other questions we couldn't get to. Thank you so much for watching the interview. You can ask your questions and join the discussion on the Bookmarked channel in Slack. Manuel will be there to answer questions for all of you. And as a reminder, Lead Dev Bookmarked is a monthly book club. Next month, we'll be speaking with Maisha T. Hill on her book, Check Your Privilege. And in November, we'll be speaking with Sin Chan Lim on recognizing empathy. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you in the Slack channel.